We now welcome our speaker for the morning, Professor Mehta from NYU and the School of Journalism, but I wanted to say one more good thing about our many neighbors that surround the park. When the clinic started growing, maybe 200, 300, 400, and then started hitting 500 just about every Tuesday night, we ran out of space. We just ran out of space. And so at the last minute, we'd be sticking people in closets and hallways, and it was all very exciting, but it wasn't giving the kind of care that we wanted to do. And so we put out the word through Alan Hunter and many of you who work at NYU, and we had 5 departments one Tuesday night say at the last minute, bring your people over here. The Spanish department, the German department, the history department, and on and on. And it was so gratifying. And the law school, of course, which has been our partner from the very, very beginning. So it's nice to have neighbors. Welcome, neighbor.
Thank you all. I'm truly honored to be here. I've been a part of the Greenwich Village community since the 1980s when I was an undergraduate at NYU. And I'm still here. I now teach at NYU. I live in Silver Towers, not too far from here, so thank you for inviting me and to give me a chance to talk about my book. It's called This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Calcutta, and I grew up in Bombay, in India. And in 1977, I immigrated with my family to Jackson Heights in Queens. And I grew up in Jackson Heights, and then I went to NYU, and then I went to Iowa City, straight from Jackson Heights, from the most diverse neighborhood in the country to the home of the world's biggest pig. at the Iowa State Fair, it was truly impressive. But, you know, I'm an immigrant, and with each year, I felt my place in this country becoming more and more secure. Whenever I've lived in England, I could never really feel English. I've lived in France, I could never really feel French. I've lived in Brazil, I've never really could feel Brazilian. But always when my plane would come back from wherever, and I was flying into JFK, and I'd see the Long Island shoreline out the window, I'd feel a sense of gladness. This is home, this is where I belong. In New York City particularly, where 2 out of 3 of us New Yorkers are immigrants or our children. Both of my children were born on the island of Manhattan. But in 2016, for the first time, with the election, I felt my place in this country being questioned. And it's not just in this country, it's all over the world. There's more people moving now than at any other point in human history. Today, there are 250 million people who are living in a country other than the one they were born in. And there's never been more of a backlash against these migrants. So I thought about, you know, why are people moving? Because the whole debate around immigration is told from the viewpoint of the rich countries. How many should we let in? Should we let them in at all? If we let them in, should they be skilled or unskilled migrants? What kind should they be? What ethnicity? What skin color? These are all being debated. But I feel what's missing is the viewpoint of the migrants themselves. Why are they moving in the first place? So my book begins with a story that my grandfather once told me. My grandfather was born in India when the British still ruled the country. And the British had bankrupted India during colonial rule. When the British got to India in the 1700s, India's share of world GDP was around 23%, so a quarter of the world's GDP almost. By the time the British left in 1947, India's share of world GDP was under 4%. So my grandfather couldn't make a living in India, and so he moved to another part of the empire, to Kenya, when it was also ruled by the British. And he worked hard there, and his son moved to England. So my grandfather retired to London. And so my grandfather was sitting in a park in North London one morning in the 1990s, minding his own business. And this elderly British gent comes up to him and says, "Why are you here? Why don't you go back to your country?" And my grandfather said, "Because we are the creditors. You came to my country, you took all my gold and my diamonds, you prevented us from building our industries, so we've come here to collect." So we are here, my grandfather said, because you were there. So it seems to me, a lot of the reasons people move is because the rich countries have stolen the future of the poor countries through colonialism, through corporate colonialism, which replaced colonialism, through war, and through climate change. People are moving not because they hate their homes or their families or their language or their foods, but because they have no choice. So I spent quite some time going around the world, actually speaking to these migrants, asking the reasons why they move. Because, the whole debate around migration now has been formed by these populists, these men, whether it's Trump here or Modi in India or Erdogan in Turkey or Putin in Russia, Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, this morning, Gotabaya in Sri Lanka. These are men, a populist basically is a gifted storyteller, someone who can tell a false story well. And often the stories they tell are about outsiders. And the language that they use to describe these migrants, robbers, rapists, termites, parasites, the only way these stories can be fought, because a populist is a gifted storyteller. He can tell a false story well, and the only way to fight him is by telling a true story better. So I'm a storyteller, and in response to the present emergency, I've been working on a book about New York for 10 years. I put it aside, and I wrote this book. And I went out and spoke to the migrants to see what they're made of, why they move. So I'll give you one story. There's a place south of San Diego on the US-Mexico border called Friendship Park. It's the only place along the entire southern border where if you're on this side of the border and you don't have papers and you want to see your family, you can actually meet them face to face. So it's a little patch of ground between San Diego and Tijuana. There's actually a wall, but the wall ends just before it gets to the sea. There's a little patch of ground which was inaugurated under the Nixon administration, where you could go and your family could come from the other side. You could sit and have a picnic with them. You could give them a hug. Then they would have to go back. You would have to go back here if you didn't have papers. So over successive administrations, this place, Friendship Park, got more and more rigid. So under the Clinton and then the Obama administrations, there was a fence put in of these bollards. And under the Trump administration now, there's a thick mesh iron fence. And you can only see your families for 10 minutes at a time on weekends. So I went there to see what this was about. And it's the most heartbreaking reporting I've ever done. I saw a Mexican man who hadn't seen his mother for 17 years. He had moved here because she needed medical care. So he moved here, and every week he would send her money. And he would work brutally hard in Colorado so that he could send his family money. And he wanted to see his mom. And he was, Skype wasn't enough. So finally, they decided they were going to meet at Friendship Park. And I saw him go towards the fence. And there's this thick fence. He puts his face up to the fence, and his mom puts up her face on the other side. And he says, "Mom, I miss you." she says, "I love you. Have you been eating right? You look thin." The eternal question all moms ask. He said he could feel her breath on his face. He wanted to give her a hug, but it's a thick fence. So all he could do is put up his hand to the fence, and the holes in the fence are only large enough to allow a pinky finger to go through. So he puts up his pinky finger, mom puts up her pinky finger, and they do this thing called the Pinkie Kiss. And all along the fence, there's mothers and children, husbands and wives, siblings, doing this kissing of the pinkies for 10 minutes before the border patrol tells them they must leave, they must go back to their own sides of the fence. Why are these fences here, these borders, these walls? I spoke to the head of the border patrol, the man who had created these rules about the 10-minute times. And it was a kind of fascinating interview. He's a man named Rodney Scott, a man from Indiana. He now wants the relatives to move even further apart. He's planning a bollard-style fence which should allow people to see their families better than the current mesh does, but would move them 4 feet apart. So you still won't be able to pass things through it, he told me. You still won't be able to hug through it or shake hands, but you'd be able to actually see the person you're talking to. Not even a pinky could kiss under Scott's plans for his fence. Scott is a devout Christian, he says, and thinks of his profession in Christian terms. "I believe that my job is my calling. I ended up here for a reason somehow." He's often on Fox News, and he's often showing Trump around the border. You might have seen him on TV. "What happens when you have to separate a child from its mother?" I ask, bringing up the Trump administration's recently announced policy of forcibly separating migrant children from their parents. How do you reconcile that with your biblical principles of giving hospitality to a stranger? "I don't see the conflict that some others see," Scott responds. "I go back to the original sin, to the Garden of Eden. There were consequences. They got deported out of the Garden of Eden, and God created a border around it." He elaborates, "My understanding of biblical principles is there's always consequences for your actions, and you're not exempt from them. If you want to take another biblical story of the last days on the cross, a sinner was forgiven, but no one took him off the cross. He still had to pay the price for his transgressions. We carry out our job very compassionately every day, but we didn't create borders. They've been around since the beginning of time. We didn't create the concept of deportation. I think it was created in Genesis 3:23. It wasn't Obama, as his critics allege. It was God who was the deporter-in-chief, and the first illegal aliens were Adam and Eve." This was this man's understanding of Christianity, and he's responsible for enforcing the borders. But it's not just in this country. It's all around the world. This fear and hatred of migrants. But it's us in the rich countries that created these problems. In the last couple of decades, $872 billion of Mexican money moved from Mexico to the United States. Around that same time, some 16 million Mexicans also moved to the US. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just following the money, their money. Why is the entire Middle East aflame? Why are Syrians and Iraqis leaving their homes? Well, it's because we went in there and we created this illegal and unnecessary war in which 600,000 Iraqis lost their lives and the entire region was set aflame. They are moving because we were there. But in terms of climate change, in terms of migration, when it comes to climate change, you ain't seen nothing yet. By the middle of the century, there's going to be 1 billion people who are displaced by climate change. We Americans are 4% of the world's population, but we put 1/3 of the excess carbon in the atmosphere, and European countries another 1/4. So as a result, there are people in India and Africa roasting to death. They can't grow anything in their fields. Their wells and lakes are dry. I've met these migrants firsthand. They have to move because they have no choice. And they move because they want to do what all of us want to do. They want to take care of their families. They're not termites or robbers or rapists. In my book, I call them ordinary heroes. The story of migration, though, in the end, my book is an angry book because I'm angry on behalf of these people who've been so vilified. But in the end, it's a good news story because when people move, everyone benefits. The migrants benefit because for refugees, it's literally a matter of life and death. I met a young Honduran mother in a women's shelter in Tijuana, and she had this beautiful 18-month-old baby playing in her lap. And she was going to claim political asylum. Her husband had witnessed a gang murder, and the gang had come. The husband had fled to the United States, and the gang had come the next day to her home and said, "Oh, your husband's gone, that's fine. We'll take your baby boy instead." She also fled, and she had this baby, and she was going to apply for political asylum. So this was last year, the height of the family separation policies, where we snatched babies from their mother's arms and put them in shelters hundreds of miles away. And I said to her, if you do this, if you go across the border, they might take your baby away from you. And she had tears in her eyes. She said, this is what a mother's love is. I know that might happen. I know they might take away my boy, whom I love more than my own life. And I might never see him again. But at least I'll know that he's alive somewhere. And someday I might have a hope of seeing him. But if I stayed where I was, I knew I would have to put him in a hole 6 feet below the ground. So I would rather take that chance. This is the choice that migrants are faced with. So when they move, it's literally a matter of life and death for so many of them. It's also an enormous benefit to the countries that they're moving to because the rich countries aren't making enough babies. Our social security system will be bankrupt if we don't continue to let in immigrants. It's the young immigrants who work hard, and they're younger, and they're a bigger share of the labor force than the rapidly aging populations in the rich countries, whether it's here or in Germany or Japan. We need immigrants. The great thing about America, the reason that I still believe in American exceptionalism, is that it's a country made up of all the other countries. That's why I'm proud to call myself American. And when migrants move, it's also great for the countries that they move from, because remittances, the money that they send back in $5 and $10 increments in these gyros, if you go to neighborhoods like Jackson Heights, it seems like every other store is a money transfer store. There's a place you can get a haircut and transfer money at the same time. Last year, the total amount of remittances, which amounted to some $700 billion, sent by migrants in the rich countries back to their families in the poor countries, that $700 billion amounted to more than 4 times all the foreign aid given by rich countries to the poor countries, more than 100 times all the debt relief that was granted. Remittances are the best and most targeted way of helping the global poor because this money isn't going to corrupt governments in these countries. It's going to their families to pay a hospital bill, send a child to school, build a house. So it's a good news story. People should move, and when they move, everyone's better off. But in the end, as I said, it's a battle of storytelling, of who should move and how much room we have, room at the inn, to take in the stranger. So I'd like to end with a passage which is not from my new book, but from a book that I wrote about the city of Bombay. It's called Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found. And when I wrote this book, I'd moved back from New York to Bombay because Bombay had been ripped apart by these horrendous Hindu-Muslim riots. And the same thing is happening in India today. India has 200 million Muslims, but they're systematically being otherized by the government in charge. And I saw a lot of things that really broke my heart in the city I'd grown up in. People getting slaughtered for belonging to the wrong religion. I sat in police stations and watched people getting tortured. And I looked for hope in this incredibly crowded city. There are more people living on the island of Bombay than on the continent of Australia. How do they fit them in? And I found hope in the strangest place, in the incredibly crowded commuter trains of Bombay, the equivalent of the Bombay subway. The manager of Bombay's suburban railway system was recently asked when the system would improve to a point where it could carry its 10 million daily passengers in comfort. Not in my lifetime, he answered. Certainly, if you commute into Bombay, you are made aware of the precise temperature of the human body as it curls around you on all sides, adjusting itself to every curve of your own. A lover's embrace was never so close. My friend Asad bin Saif works in an institute for secularism, moving tirelessly among the slums, cataloging numberless communal flare-ups and riots, seeing firsthand the slow destruction of the social fabric of the city. Asad is from Bhagalpur in the northern state of Bihar, site not only of some of the worst communal rioting in the nation, but also of a gory incident where the local police blinded a group of petty criminals with knitting needles and acid. Asad, of all people, has seen humanity at its worst. I asked him if he feels pessimistic about the human race. Not at all, he responded. Look at the hands from the trains. If you are late for work in the morning in Bombay, and you reach the station just as the train is leaving the platform, you can run up to the packed compartments and find many hands stretching out to grab you on board, unfolding outward from the train like petals. As you run alongside the train, you will be picked up and some tiny space will be made for your feet on the edge of the open doorway. The rest is up to you. You will probably have to hang on to the door frame with your fingertips, being careful not to lean out too far, lest you get decapitated by a pole placed too close to the tracks. But consider what has happened. Your fellow passengers, already packed tighter than cattle are legally allowed to be, their shirts already drenched in sweat in the badly ventilated compartment, having stood like this for hours, retain an empathy for you. Know that your boss might yell at you or cut your pay if you miss this train, and will make space where none exists to take one more person with them. And at the moment of contact, they do not know if the hand that is reaching for theirs belongs to a Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Brahmin or untouchable, or whether you were born in this city or arrived only this morning, or whether you live in the rich area of Malabar Hill or New York or Jogeshwari in the slums, whether you're from Bombay or Mumbai or New York. All they know is that you're trying to get to the city of gold, and that's enough. Come on board, they say. We'll adjust. So if those people on those trains in Bombay can adjust and take one more person with them, then certainly all the rest of us can. Thank you.